This isn't just about the numbers on these contracts. It's about recognizing the value of every person in this room.
And she is absolutely right.
Mr. Hawthorne, the projections you've been shown are based on flawed data. I have proof.
Never assume a uniform tells you everything about a person. The laughter came easily to the people seated around the private dining table. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across polished marble floors while rain slid down the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive in New York City, the kind of place where reservations were booked months in advance and billion-dollar conversations happened over expensive dinners. At the center of the room sat Richard Hawthorne, a 52-year-old billionaire known for turning struggling companies into global empires. Investors respected him. Business magazines celebrated him. People rarely questioned him. That evening, Richard was hosting several important guests from Japan. The dinner was supposed to strengthen a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every detail had been carefully arranged. Every seat had been chosen. Every course had been planned. Standing quietly beside the table was Nia Carter, a 28-year-old black waitress who had worked at the restaurant for nearly 4 years. She moved gracefully through the room, refilling water glasses, serving dishes, and making sure everything ran smoothly. Most guests barely noticed her. That was normal. In luxury restaurants, the best service often appeared invisible. As Nia approached the table carrying a tray of drinks, she overheard one of the Japanese investors speaking softly to another guest. She understood every word immediately. Her expression remained calm. She continued serving without reacting. A few moments later, Richard glanced toward her while discussing business projections with his guests. One investor asked whether the translator would arrive before the official negotiation began. Richard laughed and waved his hand dismissively. Then he looked toward Nia and said, "Do not worry. She probably understands less than the coffee machine." Several people around the table chuckled. One guest nearly spilled his drink from laughing. The comment was not shouted. It was delivered casually, as though it were harmless humor. But the words settled heavily in the room. Nia heard every syllable. She understood exactly what he meant. She also understood the Japanese conversation that followed. The investors exchanged brief, uncomfortable glances. Richard never noticed. He leaned back in his chair, completely confident that everyone shared his view of the situation. Nia simply nodded politely and continued working. Years earlier, comments like that would have ruined her entire evening. Not anymore. Life had taught her patience. She delivered another round of drinks and quietly returned to the service station. From there, she could see the entire dining room. Rain tapped softly against the glass while the lights of Manhattan shimmered below like scattered gold. The city felt alive beneath the storm. Around her, servers moved between tables. Dishes emerged from the kitchen. Conversations blended into a steady hum. Yet Nia found herself thinking about the guests from Japan. She understood their concerns. She understood the cultural misunderstandings already forming beneath the surface of the meeting. More importantly, she understood something Richard did not. The evening was heading toward a problem, a serious one. The translator scheduled for the negotiation had not arrived. Traffic delays caused by the storm were getting worse by the minute. One glance at the worried faces around the table told her everything she needed to know. The partnership Richard cared so much about was balanced on a fragile foundation. And nobody in that room realized that the one person capable of helping was the woman they had just laughed at. From the service station near the kitchen entrance, Nia Carter watched the evening continue unfolding exactly as she feared. The private dining room remained filled with polished confidence, expensive suits, and carefully rehearsed business smiles. Yet beneath the surface, tension was beginning to grow. The Japanese investors spoke quietly among themselves while Richard Hawthorne continued discussing projections, expansion plans, and future partnerships. Every person at the table appeared successful. Every person seemed certain of their own importance. The only uncertainty was the missing translator. Rain continued falling outside, turning the windows into shimmering walls of silver and gold. Nia picked up a tray of empty glasses and returned to the dining room. As she approached the table, fragments of Japanese conversation drifted toward her. She understood every word effortlessly. One investor was expressing concern about a clause hidden inside the proposed agreement. Another worried that the American team misunderstood the pace at which their company preferred to move. The comments were polite, but the concerns were real. Richard remained completely unaware. He smiled confidently and continued speaking through brief, translated notes sent earlier by email. The problem was that those notes no longer reflected the current discussion. Nia set fresh water glasses onto the table and stepped back. No one paid attention to her. That was normal. People often spoke freely around service staff because they assumed they were invisible. Tonight, that assumption was becoming dangerous. Across the room, the restaurant manager checked his phone repeatedly. The translator still had not arrived. Traffic across Manhattan had slowed to a crawl because of the storm. Every minute increased the risk of confusion. Richard glanced at his watch. For the first time all evening, impatience appeared on his face. One of the investors asked when the translator would arrive. Richard forced a smile. Soon, hopefully. But even he sounded less certain than before. Nia carried another tray toward the kitchen and paused briefly beside a hallway mirror. For a moment, she saw not a waitress but the person she had spent years becoming. Long before she worked at the restaurant, she had dreamed of an entirely different future. At 19, she had earned a prestigious scholarship in international languages. Professors praised her gift for communication. She studied Japanese for years. She spent late nights translating business articles, novels, and academic papers. Her future seemed limitless. Then her mother became seriously ill. Hospital visits replaced university classes. Medical bills replaced tuition plans. Eventually, Nia made a choice. She left school to care for her family. The scholarship disappeared. The career she imagined vanished with it. Yet she never stopped learning. Every spare hour became an opportunity to study. Every book became a teacher. Every challenge became motivation. Most people who met her now saw only a waitress carrying trays. They never saw the years of sacrifice hidden behind the uniform. Returning to the dining room, she noticed the atmosphere changing again. The Japanese guests were speaking more frequently among themselves. Their expressions had become cautious. Richard continued presenting information, but small misunderstandings were beginning to stack on top of one another. Tiny cracks were forming beneath the conversation. Nia recognized them immediately. She knew cultural misunderstandings often started that way. A phrase interpreted incorrectly. A gesture misunderstood. An assumption left uncorrected. The consequences could become enormous. Standing beside the service station, she listened quietly while thunder rolled faintly beyond the windows. The city lights shimmered through the rain. Somewhere in the distance, sirens echoed across Manhattan. Then one storm like a sea of moving lights. Crystal glasses reflected gold and silver across the polished table. Everything looked successful from the outside. Inside the conversation, however, problems were beginning to multiply. One of the Japanese executives politely asked about the implementation timeline for the proposed partnership. Richard immediately responded with a detailed explanation. The executive nodded respectfully. Then he exchanged another glance with his colleagues. Nia Carter noticed it immediately. She understood the concern hidden behind their polite expressions. In Japanese business culture, direct disagreement was often communicated subtly. Silence could mean hesitation. A glance could mean concern. A carefully chosen phrase could signal serious reservations. Richard missed every signal. He interpreted their courtesy as agreement. Standing near the service station, Nia felt her concern growing. She carried another tray into the room and quietly refreshed water glasses. As she moved around the table, she listened. The Japanese investors continued speaking among themselves. Their concerns were becoming more obvious. They respected Richard's success. They admired his accomplishments. But they were beginning to worry that he was not listening carefully enough. One investor mentioned trust. Another mentioned long-term stability. A third quietly expressed concern about moving too quickly. Richard remained focused on numbers, projections, and expansion opportunities. The two sides were discussing the same partnership while imagining completely different futures. Across the room, the restaurant manager checked his phone once again. Still no translator. The delay was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard finally noticed the manager's expression and frowned. "Any update?" he asked. The manager shook his head. "The roads are nearly stopped because of the storm." Richard forced another smile toward his guests. "We can manage until then." The investors nodded politely. Yet the atmosphere continued changing. What had started as a confident business dinner was slowly becoming a negotiation filled with uncertainty. Nia returned to the kitchen briefly before stepping back into the dining room. The sounds of conversation mixed with the soft music playing throughout the restaurant. Plates moved in and out of the room. Other guests enjoyed their meals without realizing a major deal was quietly drifting toward trouble only a few feet away. As Nia approached the table again, one of the Japanese investors asked a question in his native language. He directed the question toward his colleagues rather than Richard. The answer came quickly. Nia understood every word. Her heart sank. They were discussing whether the partnership should be postponed entirely. Richard continued speaking, unravel one misunderstanding at a time. Rain continued sliding down the giant windows overlooking Manhattan. The storm had transformed the city into a landscape of blurred lights and reflections. Inside the restaurant, warm golden lighting created an atmosphere of luxury and calm. The contrast felt almost ironic. Everything looked beautiful while an important business relationship moved closer to failure. One of the senior Japanese investors finally leaned forward and asked a question through limited English. His tone remained respectful. Richard answered immediately. The investor nodded politely. Then he turned toward his colleagues and spoke in Japanese. Nia understood every word. Her stomach tightened. The investor was explaining that he believed Richard valued speed more than trust. Another executive quietly agreed. A third mentioned concerns about long-term commitment. None of them were discussing numbers anymore. They were discussing character, trust, respect, the foundations that often mattered more than money. Richard smiled confidently, unaware that the discussion had moved beyond financial projections. He believed he was winning the room. In reality, the room was slowly moving away from him. The restaurant manager entered briefly and approached the table. Everyone immediately looked toward him, hoping for good news. The manager apologized and explained that the translator remained stuck across the city because of severe traffic delays. Silence followed. For the first time all evening, genuine frustration appeared on Richard's face. He glanced toward the windows, then toward the investors. "We can continue," he said. "I am sure we will work through any small misunderstandings." The Japanese guests exchanged another glance. Nia recognized it immediately. The phrase "small misunderstandings" had landed poorly. To them, the misunderstandings were becoming increasingly significant. Richard did not notice. He continued speaking. One investor asked another question in Japanese. This time the concern was even more serious. They were discussing whether postponing the agreement would be wiser than moving forward. Nia felt her pulse quicken. The partnership was standing at the edge of a cliff, and nobody seemed aware of how close they were to stepping over it. She carried a fresh round of water to the table and quietly placed glasses in front of the guests. As she moved beside them, she heard another exchange in Japanese. One phrase stood out immediately. The investors believed Richard was intentionally dismissing their concerns. The misunderstanding had become personal. Nia returned to the service station. Her hands remained steady, but her thoughts raced. She knew exactly how to fix the problem. A few sentences could change everything. A simple explanation could restore trust before it disappeared completely. Yet stepping into the conversation would mean drawing attention to herself. It would mean revealing something she had spent years keeping private. Across the room, Richard continued talking while the investors listened with increasing caution. Thunder rolled softly beyond the windows. The city lights shimmered through the rain. And standing quietly beside the wall, invisible to almost everyone in the room, Nia realized the next few minutes might determine the future of everyone seated at that table. For several long minutes, Nia Carter remained exactly where she was. The silver tray rested lightly against her side while the conversation at the table continued moving in the wrong direction. Every instinct told her to step forward. Every lesson life had taught her warned her to stay silent. The room felt suspended between two possible futures. One future ended with handshakes, trust, and a successful partnership. The other ended with disappointment hidden behind polite smiles. Standing near the service station, Nia knew which future was becoming more likely. The Japanese investors were no longer discussing details. They were discussing confidence, trust, respect, things that could not be repaired by spreadsheets alone. Richard Hawthorne continued speaking with complete certainty. He outlined growth projections, market opportunities, and strategic advantages. The numbers were impressive. The vision was ambitious. Yet none of it addressed the concern that had quietly taken root around the table. One investor folded his hands and listened without interruption. Another stared thoughtfully at the rain-covered windows. A third glanced repeatedly toward his colleagues before responding. Their body language said more than their words. Nia understood every signal. Years of language study had taught her that communication extended far beyond vocabulary. Meaning lived inside pauses, expressions, and tone. At that moment, the investors were communicating caution as clearly as if they had announced it aloud. The restaurant manager walked past again and whispered another update. The translator remained trapped in traffic. Nobody knew when he would arrive. Richard nodded impatiently and dismissed the concern. "We are making progress," he said. But even he sounded less confident than before. The storm outside continued painting silver rivers across the glass. Lightning flickered faintly above the Manhattan skyline. The city seemed distant and unreal compared to the tension building inside the dining room. Nia looked toward the investors again. One of them spoke quietly in Japanese. Another answered. Then a third added something that immediately captured her attention. They were discussing whether trust had already been damaged. The words struck her harder than she expected. Trust. Once lost, trust was difficult to rebuild. Richard still had time to fix the misunderstanding, but only if someone helped him understand what was actually happening. Nia lowered her eyes briefly. Memories surfaced from years earlier. Late nights studying Japanese grammar while classmates attended parties. Long afternoons translating articles line by line. Professors encouraging her to pursue international business. Dreams that once seemed certain. She had worked too hard to acquire those skills. Yet tonight she was being asked to pretend she did not have them. A few hours earlier, Richard had joked that she understood less than a coffee machine. The guests had laughed. She could still hear it. The easier choice would be remaining silent and allowing the evening to unfold without her involvement. Nobody expected anything from a waitress. Nobody would blame her for doing her job and going home. Yet, another thought refused to leave her mind. The investors were not bad people. Richard was not evil. He was arrogant, impatient, and blinded by assumptions, but he was not malicious. Everyone at that table wanted success. They simply could not understand one another. Nia took a slow breath. Her heart beat faster. Across the room, another misunderstanding emerged. Richard answered a question that had never truly been asked. The investors exchanged their most worried glance yet. One of them quietly closed his folder. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Nia understood exactly what it meant. The negotiation was beginning to shut down. The opportunity was slipping away. She looked toward the table one final time. Then she made a decision. Setting her tray carefully onto a nearby counter, Nia straightened her shoulders and began walking toward the conversation that was about to change her life. Every conversation in the room seemed to fade as Nia Carter approached the table. The storm outside continued washing silver reflections across the massive windows, but inside the private dining room a different kind of tension had taken over. The Japanese investors sat quietly with folders resting in front of them. Richard Hawthorne remained focused on the negotiation, unaware that the opportunity he had spent months building was only moments away from slipping through his fingers. Nia stopped beside the table. For a second, she questioned her decision. Her heart was beating faster than usual. Not because she doubted her ability. She knew exactly what needed to be said. She hesitated because stepping forward would change how everyone in the room saw her. Once certain truths were revealed, there was no returning to anonymity. Richard noticed her standing nearby and looked up. His expression immediately reflected irritation. He assumed she was interrupting. "What is it?" he asked. Several guests turned toward her. Nia kept her voice calm and respectful. "Excuse me, sir. May I say something?" Richard glanced briefly at the investors before looking back at her. The timing could not have seemed worse from his perspective. A waitress interrupting a negotiation involving hundreds of millions of dollars was not something he welcomed. Yet before he could dismiss her, one of the Japanese investors looked curious and nodded politely. Nia took a slow breath. Then she turned toward the investors and spoke. The first sentence left the room completely silent. It was flawless Japanese. Not hesitant. Not memorized. Not basic conversational phrases. Her pronunciation was natural. Her rhythm was effortless. The words flowed with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering the language. For several seconds, nobody moved. One investor blinked in surprise. Another slowly lowered his coffee cup. A third leaned forward as if he had misheard what just happened. Richard stared at Nia. The expression on his face shifted from annoyance to disbelief. Nia continued speaking. She politely summarized the concern that had been causing confusion throughout the evening. Then she carefully explained how Richard had misunderstood several cultural signals during the discussion. Her tone remained respectful toward both sides. She was not correcting anyone. She was building a bridge. The investors listened intently. As she continued, their expressions began changing. The tension that had dominated the room started dissolving. Several executives nodded in agreement. One investor even smiled for the first time all evening. Richard remained speechless. The woman he had joked about only hours earlier was now doing something nobody else in the room could do. Nia translated the concerns surrounding trust, long-term partnership, and implementation timelines. More importantly, she explained the intentions behind those concerns. Suddenly, both sides understood each other. Questions that had created confusion now received clear answers. Assumptions were corrected. Misunderstandings disappeared. The room felt lighter with every sentence she spoke. When she finally finished, silence returned. This time it was a different kind of silence. One of the senior Japanese investors looked directly at her and responded in Japanese. Nia answered immediately. Their conversation continued for another minute. Then the investor smiled broadly and turned toward Richard. "Now we understand each other," he said in English. Richard sat completely still. The billionaire who always had answers could not find a single word. Around the table, investors looked at Nia with genuine respect. Nobody saw a waitress anymore. They saw intelligence, discipline, and talent. Outside, rain continued falling across the Manhattan skyline. Inside, however, the entire evening had changed. And for the first time since the dinner began, Richard Hawthorne realized he had been completely wrong about the person standing right in front of him. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. For a few seconds, nobody seemed interested in the partnership, the financial projections, or the storm outside. Every eye in the room remained fixed on Nia Carter. The same waitress who had spent the evening quietly refilling water glasses had just transformed a failing negotiation into a productive conversation. The shift was impossible to ignore. The Japanese investors no longer appeared hesitant. Their expressions had softened. Their posture had relaxed. For the first time all night, genuine optimism returned to the table. Richard Hawthorne sat motionless, trying to process what had happened. His mind replayed the moment again and again. Only an hour earlier, he had made a careless joke at Nia's expense. He had assumed she was simply part of the background. Someone who carried trays and delivered meals. Someone whose world was completely separate from his own. Now he was staring at proof of how wrong he had been. One of the senior Japanese investors smiled warmly and addressed Nia directly. They exchanged several sentences in Japanese. The conversation flowed naturally, almost effortlessly. When they finished, the investor looked toward Richard. "Your employee is very impressive," he said. "She understands both language and culture. That is rare." Richard nodded slowly. For perhaps the first time that evening, he did not trust himself to speak immediately. Nia remained composed despite the attention. She had not stepped forward to impress anyone. She had stepped forward because she could see a problem and knew how to help. The difference mattered. Another investor asked her a question, then another. Soon the room became genuinely curious about her background. Richard listened quietly as one of the executives finally asked the question everyone seemed to be wondering. "Where did you learn Japanese?" Nia hesitated briefly. She was never comfortable talking about herself. Yet refusing to answer would have felt strange after everything that had happened. She smiled politely. "I studied international languages in college." Several people nodded with interest. "I received a scholarship," she continued. "I plan to work in international business one day." Richard leaned forward slightly. The answer surprised him. The investors seemed equally intrigued. One executive asked why she was not working in that field now. Nia lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "My mother became seriously ill. I left school to help take care of her." The room became quiet again. This silence felt different from the earlier shock. It carried respect, understanding. One of the Japanese investors nodded thoughtfully. Another offered a few words of encouragement. Richard remained completely still. He suddenly realized how little he knew about the people around him. For years he had built companies, negotiated contracts, and managed enormous teams. Yet he had never taken the time to learn the story of the woman serving his dinner. The realization was uncomfortable. Nia's uniform had hidden an entire world of experience, sacrifice, and discipline. Or perhaps the uniform had not hidden anything at all. Perhaps he had simply chosen not to look. Outside, the rain finally began easing. The lights of Manhattan appeared sharper through the glass. Inside the dining room, the atmosphere felt transformed. The investors resumed discussing the partnership, but now the conversation carried a sense of trust that had been missing earlier. Richard listened carefully. For once, he paid attention not only to the words being spoken, but also to the people speaking them. And every time his eyes drifted toward Nia, he found himself asking the same uncomfortable question. How many other extraordinary people had he overlooked simply because he thought he already knew who they were? The remainder of the evening unfolded very differently from how anyone had expected. The tension that had dominated the room for hours gradually gave way to something far more valuable: understanding. The Japanese investors resumed their discussion with renewed confidence. Questions that had once produced confusion now led to productive conversations. Concerns that had seemed impossible to bridge suddenly felt manageable. The partnership was no longer drifting toward collapse. It was moving forward again. Richard Hawthorne watched the transformation unfold with a level of attention he rarely gave anyone. Throughout his career, he had learned to recognize talent. Yet what unsettled him was not simply Nia Carter's intelligence. It was the realization that her intelligence had been visible all along. The only reason he had failed to see it was because he never looked beyond her uniform. That thought remained with him as the evening continued. Several investors spoke warmly with Nia throughout the remainder of the dinner. One executive asked about her favorite Japanese authors. Another asked which regions of Japan she had studied most extensively. Nia answered each question with quiet confidence. She never exaggerated her accomplishments. She never tried to impress anyone. She simply spoke honestly. That honesty seemed to earn even more respect from the guests. As dessert was served, the atmosphere felt almost unrecognizable compared to the beginning of the evening. Laughter returned to the table, but this time it carried warmth rather than arrogance. Conversations flowed naturally. Even the storm outside appeared to be fading. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the lights of Manhattan sparkled more clearly beyond the glass. Near the end of the dinner, the senior Japanese investor stood and raised his glass. Everyone in the room became quiet. He thanked Richard for hosting the evening and expressed optimism about the future partnership. Then, to Richard's surprise, he turned toward Nia. "Tonight would have ended very differently without your help," he said. Several guests nodded immediately. Richard felt a knot form in his chest. The statement was completely true. Without Nia, the partnership might have failed before anyone understood why. Nia smiled politely and thanked the investor. She seemed slightly uncomfortable being the center of attention. After years of working quietly behind the scenes, public recognition did not come naturally to her. The investor then asked one final question. "If circumstances had been different, what career would you have chosen?" Nia paused briefly before answering. "International business and cultural consulting," she said. The room became silent again. Richard looked down for a moment. The answer felt almost painful. Sitting only a few feet away from him was someone who possessed exactly the skills his companies often spend enormous sums trying to find. Yet she had spent years carrying trays while people overlooked her. The dinner eventually came to an end. Guests gathered their belongings and exchanged handshakes. Business cards changed hands. Promises of future meetings filled the room. As people prepared to leave, Richard found himself standing alone beside one of the giant windows overlooking the city. He watched the investors speak warmly with Nia before departing. Their respect for her was obvious. More importantly, it was earned. For several minutes, Richard said nothing. He simply observed. Then, as Nia began clearing the final dishes from the table, he walked toward her. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background. For the first time since the evening began, he approached her not as a billionaire speaking to a waitress, but as one human being speaking to another. And for perhaps the first time in many years, Richard Hawthorne found himself preparing to admit that he had been wrong. Richard Hawthorne stopped beside the table as Nia Carter gathered the last of the dishes. Around them, the restaurant was gradually returning to normal. Staff moved quietly through the dining room. The final guests were leaving. Outside, the storm had almost disappeared. Only a few drops of rain still traced paths across the giant windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights reflected against the wet streets below, creating ribbons of gold, white, and blue stretching into the distance. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Richard was not accustomed to uncertainty. Throughout his career, he had negotiated billion-dollar agreements, managed crises, and addressed rooms full of powerful people without hesitation. Yet finding the right words now felt surprisingly difficult. Finally, he looked at Nia and spoke quietly. "I owe you an apology." Nia paused and turned toward him. Richard lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "What I said earlier was wrong. I made assumptions about you that I should never have made. There was no audience left to impress. No investors watching. No cameras. Only honesty." Nia studied him for a moment. She could hear sincerity in his voice. More importantly, she could see it. "Thank you," she said softly. Richard nodded. The simple response somehow made the apology feel even more meaningful. He glanced toward the windows where the lights of Manhattan stretched across the horizon. "Tonight would have been a disaster without you." Nia smiled slightly. Everyone was trying to accomplish the same thing. They just needed help understanding each other. Richard laughed quietly. "You make it sound simple." "Sometimes it is simple," Nia replied. "People just stop listening." The words settled between them. Richard found himself reflecting on the entire evening. For years, he had measured success through numbers, acquisitions, and growth charts. Yet the most important lesson he learned that night had arrived from someone carrying a serving tray. He looked back at Nia. "You should be doing more than this," he said. Nia understood what he meant. She also understood that life rarely followed the plans people imagined when they were young. "Maybe someday," she answered. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a business card. "If someday comes, call me." Nia accepted it politely, but without excitement or expectation. She had learned long ago not to build her future around promises. Richard seemed to recognize that. He smiled and extended his hand. This time there was no trace of arrogance. No assumption of superiority. Only respect. Nia shook his hand. The gesture lasted only a moment, but it marked the true ending of the evening. Soon afterward, she finished her shift and stepped outside. The air felt fresh after the rain. Traffic moved through the city below, glowing towers of glass and steel. She pulled her coat a little tighter and began walking toward the subway station. Behind her, the restaurant lights shone warmly against the dark streets. High above the sidewalk, Richard remained near the window. He watched as Nia disappeared into the flow of people moving through Manhattan. The city continued exactly as it always had. Cars passed. Lights changed. Conversations drifted through the night air. Yet something important had changed inside him. For years he had believed success gave him the ability to judge people quickly. Tonight had taught him the opposite. Some of the most extraordinary stories existed behind faces the world barely noticed. Down on the street, Nia continued walking with calm, steady steps. She carried no trophy. She had not sought recognition. She had simply chosen kindness when silence would have been easier. Above the city, the clouds finally parted. A faint glow of moonlight appeared between the buildings. And in the quiet space between one chapter and the next, the night seemed to breathe with the simple, undeniable truth that dignity never depends on status, and wisdom can appear in places where nobody thinks to look.
Your willingness to see our perspective means a great deal.
Yeah.
We won't disappoint you.
The feeling is mutual, Miss Carter. To new beginnings.